A land untamed by man lay on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. No one truly knew where it ended, its inhabitants being warlike and resisting towards any outside invader. Long deemed unworthy of settlement by European empires, this land was soon to become the cause of a war that would change the course of history forever. Colonization of the Americas started much before any sophisticated European settlement was established in the area of the modern United States. From the 15th century onwards, the Spanish and Portuguese empires conquered and subjugated the sophisticated civilizations of South and Central America. In these places, a very hierarchical social order was already in place. The same, however, could not be said about the northern portion of the double continent. The wild and seemingly endless stretches of land did at first glance not seem to have any valuable resources. Instead of sprawling cities and mountains of gold, the European conquerors found only death and despair in an untamed wilderness filled with hostile natives who lived in tents and subsisted on hunting and gathering. Although claimed by the Spanish Empire after the Treaty of Tordesillas, this land remained unsettled until other European empires arriving late to the colonial game in the Americas set up shop in these lands. First settlements in North America were mostly given up by the colonists out of a lack of food, disease, cold, or the attacks of the natives. After some fruitless attempts, however, Dutch, French, and English settlers finally managed to gain a foothold in the Americas in the early 1600s. The Protestant power of Great Britain established itself on the east coast, while the Catholic French Empire claimed what is now Canada and the American Midwest. Claiming this huge landmass made the French Empire the second largest empire on paper. Rule, however, in these regions was far from direct. Apart from very few coastal cities like New Orleans, Quebec, or Montreal, this huge French empire consisted of forts and trading outposts, sprinkled at a few places, maintaining a network of alliances through gift-giving. The only valuable resources from these lands were furs, as these sold at exorbitant prices on European markets. It was mainly procured by the local trade relations with the indigenous tribes. The society of these North American tribes was deeply shaken by the arrival of the yellow-haired creatures with long knives at their shores. European diseases imported by the newcomers wreaked havoc amongst the natives, whose immune systems had no defense against them. A 2 million population of Native Americans in 1600 shrank to about 250,000 by the mid-1750s. These massive amounts of deaths threatened to destroy entire nations. As a response, many native tribes resorted to making war on their neighbors in order to kidnap members of their tribes to integrate them into their own. In raids on European settlements, captives were also taken and sometimes integrated into the tribe. The fur trade with the Europeans also encouraged a brutal struggle for hunting grounds, as European weapons and tools gave certain tribes advantages over others. A series of wars called the Beaver Wars, which was essentially a struggle for hunting grounds, brought a new protagonist on the North American stage, the Iroquois Confederacy. Consisting of 7 tribes, this confederacy brutally conquered its neighbors, extinguishing many other native nations in the process. For the French, however, who nominally owned the land where all of this was happening, the colony was more of a geopolitical asset than an economically viable one. The sugar-producing islands of the Caribbean far exceeded New France in revenue and importance to the French state. Nevertheless, under the rule of the Sun King Louis XIV, the region was further developed and fortified. Louisburg at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River being greatly fortified in order to keep the river free of any future English incursions. On the English-settled East Coast, the involvement of government was never really anything close to what the French or Spanish did in their colonization efforts. Here the land was largely settled on private initiative. This relative absence of government created local colonial assemblies and created a state of self-rule unprecedented in any other parts of the Americas. This style of non-intervention and self-rule lured many European settlers to the English colonies, with their population soon far exceeding the French ones in their geographically much larger empire. Some colonies were chartered off to companies using the land to grow cash crops, like it was the case with Virginia. Other savvy colonizers like William Penn of Pennsylvania promised the settlers a new life free of military service to their lord. He achieved this by assigning the protection of the land to the local Shawnee and Delaware tribes in exchange for supplying them with European-style tools and weapons. This state of affairs, however, wouldn't last as more Europeans flooded to Pennsylvania. With the death of William Penn in 1718, his heirs, eager to sell the native lands for profit, finally saw their chance in the Iroquois Confederacy. Since the Beaver Wars, the Confederacy had claimed overlordship over the Delaware and Shawnee peoples despite never actually ruling over them. William Penn's heirs struck a deal with the Iroquois in 1731. The Iroquois sold the native land in Pennsylvania to the Penns despite not actually owning said land. This land theft led to an exodus of these tribes further west into the Ohio Valley. The Iroquois sent one of their chiefs to govern over the tribes in their name. This Iroquois viceroy, however, enjoyed little actual support and authority. His support among the Ohio Valley tribes was minimal, as they had no love for the Iroquois. This position of Iroquois governorship was then unceremonially called half-king. The first trading partners of these tribes now living in the Ohio Valley were initially the French, who formerly owned the territory. However, driven by a sense of profit, Irish Virginian George Corgan set up his own trading posts in the Ohio country, trading his goods from Europe and the East Coast in exchange for furs. This incursion was interpreted by the French Governor-General of Quebec, Comte de la Gatineau, as a deliberate attempt of the British colonists to make a land grab in what he considered French territory. He set Captain Celeron of the troops of the Marine as the head of an expedition into Ohio country to warn the Irish Pennsylvanian traders out. He gave a worrying report to the French governor, telling him that the natives were sometimes even hostile to his expedition. He then proceeded to bury lead tablets and post signs which marked these lands as French. However, this did little to stop Corgan's enterprise. The French strategic situation got even more precarious when the Ohio Company of Virginia was founded by 20 rich tobacco planters in 1750. Unlike the only profit-seeking Corgan, this syndicate had the intention of seizing the land in the Ohio Valley and to later sell it to white settlers. New French Governor de la Jonquière saw this as a coordinated British invasion when in fact the Virginians and Pennsylvanians were bitter competitors. When the Comte de la Jonquière died in 1752, the succeeding acting governor Baron de la Longueuil sent another expedition to the Ohio country, with more intentions than just placing signs and stone tablets. Mostly comprised of Indian allies, the French force headed by the Marquis de Langlade attacked the intruding English traders, burning down the villages of the dissenting tribes and British trading posts. Pennsylvanians pulled out of the Ohio country as a result of the raids. Virginian traders, however, saw the Pennsylvanians leaving the Ohio country as an opportunity. They, instead of leaving, expanded their operations, forging connections to the current half-king Tanachrison. This in New France was seen as proof of a coordinated land grab, and new governor Ange Duquesne de Menville, Marquis de Duquesne, who was a no-nonsense naval officer, saw this as a justification to greatly increase the fortifications of New France. He ordered the construction of a chain of forts meant to deter further English-American intrusions. Directly at the forks of the Ohio, Duquesne made his troops build a massive fort named after himself. Furthermore, he ordered the construction of Fort Presqu'Île, Fort de la Boeuf, and Fort Machault. 400 French Canadians died in this massive undertaking. The fragile economy of New France was severely impacted by the cost of the construction. The construction of the forts also stoked anxiety in Britain itself. The British government had thus far been uninvolved in affairs of its faraway colony. The construction of so much military infrastructure in New France seemed like an unprovoked aggression to the British government. Duquesne thus set the empires of Britain and France on a collision course. Virginian Royal Governor Dinwiddie was deeply unsettled by the French military build-up. For Dinwiddie, the French were encroaching on what he believed was Virginian land. He justified his claim with the 1609 Virginia Charter that stipulated that Virginian borders ran all the way to the Pacific. He was quick to inform British Prime Minister Newcastle about the situation. Newcastle and the British government wanting to deter the French from starting another war like the one that has just ended 5 years ago with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Prime Minister sent a letter to Dinwiddie instructing him to take action against the French. Dinwiddie should warn the French out of His Majesty's land, and if they didn't comply, use force to accomplish it. The British government furthermore sent aid in forms of arms and ammunition to equip a militia for this task. Governor Dinwiddie, however, was deeply entrenched in a legal conflict with the Virginian legislature, the House of Burgesses. Thus, the House of Burgesses denied his request to form a militia. All he could do at first was to send a diplomatic mission to demand that the French should leave. The 20-year-old Virginian George Washington was selected for this task, a choice Dinwiddie would learn to regret later. Washington didn't speak any French and had little diplomatic experience. He had, however, political connections ensuring his post. Washington left Williamsburg with a small entourage on November 1st, 1753. Shortly after, he met the half-king Tanaqueson, who would serve the mission as a guide. Someone more experienced with Indian diplomacy would have instantly noticed the small entourage Tanaqueson had with him. He only managed to convince Mingos to accompany him. These were essentially Iroquois immigrants to the Ohio country and represented by no means a majority of the Ohio Valley natives. The aforementioned Delaware and Shawnee seemed to not have respected the half-king enough to follow him. Unbothered by this, however, Washington made it to Fort Le Boeuf, with the French commander politely declining Dinwiddie's demands. Washington sent a report to Dinwiddie detailing his voyage, which was subsequently passed to Newcastle and the British government. The report of the forts also provided Dinwiddie with more political ammunition to make the House of Burgesses approve the raising of 200 men for a militia to expel the French. This, however, was not nearly enough. Appointed to lead the militia was again George Washington. When Washington arrived at Wills Creek, where the troops were gathering, only 159 soldiers of the promised 200 were mustered, many of them being vagabonds and poorly disciplined. The Virginians had previously tried to build their own fort at the forks of the Ohio. This little wooden stockade had been captured by the French and burned down soon after its completion. Washington got the news of this shortly after arriving at Wills Creek. Unwilling to take this provocation from the French, Washington set out from his camp to find and expel the French offenders. After marching a while, he and his militia made camp at a place called the Great Meadows. On the next morning, Christopher Gist, who was an agent for the Virginia-Ohio Company, rode into the camp, claiming that he had sighted the French company of soldiers 4 miles to the west. Washington ordered half of his men to march from their camp to intercept them. On the evening of the same day, the half-king Tanaqueson rode into camp, claiming that he had seen the French 7 miles to the north. Washington, realizing that he had sent half of his men in the wrong direction, then hastened the remainder of his men to march north. The whole night, Washington and his force blundered through the woods, accompanied by Tanaqueson and a handful of Mingo warriors. By sunset, the tired militiamen and Mingos had arrived at a rock wall overlooking a small glen, with a French camp in it. Washington quietly arrayed his men atop the rock wall, while Tanaqueson and his Mingos positioned themselves below to cut off the French retreat. When the French finally spotted the Virginians atop the wall, a firefight between both sides broke out, with both sides claiming that the other one had started it. After a short and one-sided shootout, 14 Frenchmen were casualties, with their commander Jumonville being among the wounded, who subsequently called for a ceasefire. Washington and Tanaqueson then entered the French camp. Jumonville then explained his mission to George Washington via an interpreter. He had been on a diplomatic mission to demand the departure of the Virginian troops from the area. While Jumonville tried to convey his message to the interpreter, Tanaqueson quietly stepped forward, pulling out his tomahawk. With his confused interpreter stepping aside at the sight of the imposing warrior, Tanaqueson raised his tomahawk over the wounded Jumonville, whispering, "Tu n'es pas encore mort, mon père." His tomahawk crashing down on the head of Jumonville, instantly cracking his skull. Washington, who was baffled by what he just saw, stood a while in agony with his jacket full of blood sprinkles while he tried to comprehend what just happened.